to Lolo from Fort Benton, and I go where they were on September 15th of 1805 and September 16th of 1805 and September 17th of 1805. And then I get in a car and I drive back to Fort Benton. I do it all over again. And so I'm going through the breaks, paddling, usually 3-day, 4-day trips, sometimes 10, 12 times a summer, and hitting the Lolo Trail maybe 3 or 4 times. One summer, as I was gearing up, it was maybe May, and I was looking at Gary Moulton's journals of Lewis and Clark and reading through the entries from late May of 1805, and my neighbor and friend Joe sort of asked me why I was bothering to do that. And I was like, well, I got to brush up on this stuff. People expect me to sort of yammer on about Lewis and Clark for days on end in the summer. I need to make sure I'm speaking accurately. He's like, but yeah, you'll remember when you get out there. And so I stopped, and I believe I had a beer. And later that summer, I go out to, take people camping, and I arrive at where the Lewis and Clark expedition camped on May 31st of 1805. And the journal entry and memories just flowed right into my head. And I realized that I could store this information in those places, and I didn't have to carry it with me all the time. What this did was sort of lent me some insight into oral tradition and how oral traditions work. And there's an anthropologist named Keith Basso, who was very interested in sort of place names, and he studied the Apache in New Mexico. And when he was working with them, he noticed that they had a love for place names and often rattling them off. He described how there was this Apache cowboy he was working with one day, and this guy was sitting there and sort of audibly going through the places of various names that were sort of culturally important to the Apache. And Basso asked him, why he was doing this. And he said, it allows me to ride in my mind. And so that's sort of what I want to do today. So I want to sort of introduce a sort of heady archaeological concept here of what's called a cultural landscape. And so the cultural landscape is a way of viewing a landscape, sort of with a wide angle view, where you think about how the sort of push and pull of human interactions with that landscape have changed it over time. And then the sort of stories that are attached to those places as well. And because this is a storytelling series, I decided to just sort of make this into a couple of stories. So I'm gonna tell you 2 stories today, and hopefully at the end of this, we'll all understand what exactly we mean by a cultural landscape. And if you haven't yet, if you could just mute all of your microphones, and then I am going to show my screen. So let's see here. All right, can everyone see give me a thumbs up if you see a switchboard operator. All right, so my first story is about a place called Motaatusi, and that's a Blackfeet name, and it means the place where the bundle owners live. So if we want, since this is a Lewis and Clark talk, we need to begin with Lewis and Clark. So on June 3rd of 1805, the Lewis and Clark expedition had been working its way upriver on the Missouri, and that's the orange line on this map, in case you weren't aware. And they arrived at the confluence of the Missouri and the Marias, and I've drawn the Marias in red with its 3 main tributaries here. And then in green, there's the Teton River, which is a smaller river that flows into the Marias about a mile, maybe less, from this confluence. So on June 3rd of 1805, the expedition did something unusual. They stopped and waited and deliberated. They spent a week trying to figure out if the Marias, or the Missouri as we know it, was the actual Missouri that they needed to follow to sort of take them westward to find that Northwest Passage they were seeking. And the necessity of the moment wasn't lost on Meriwether Lewis. He made a journal entry at this place where he talked about how An interesting question was now to be determined which of these rivers was the Missouri. And it was more than just an interesting question because the very morale of the expedition sort of depended on them getting the answer right. If they went up the wrong branch and had to turn back, they would have lost more time and probably would have had an even more terrible Lolo Trail experience later that September than they already did. Furthermore, there was some contention between the captains of the expedition and the men on the expedition as to which river to take. So here's a little shot of Google Earth. Once again, the Missouri is got the orange dots. We have the Marias has the red dots, and then the green dots are the Teton. And this spit of land is where the expedition camped between June 3rd and June 10th of 1805. Now, in this map, we can see the Marias is a smaller tributary to the much wider Missouri. But in the springtime, there's a lot of water coming through the Marias. And so the river was swollen and flooded. And it also always carries a very high sediment load. Whereas the Missouri at this time was flowing from the Rocky Mountains, and there wasn't the kind of agricultural plowing and soil disturbance we have today. So the water flowing down the Missouri would have been clear. The crew of the expedition was sort of used to being, waist deep in muddy water at this point. And they see a river that's muddy and a river that's clear, and they're pretty sure they should keep following the muddy one. John Ordway basically writes this in his journal entry from that day, that they were trying to make a decision about which river was which, and they dispatched some teams up each river to try to figure out, take some measurements and figure out which one has a falls on it, which was one of the things they were looking for. But the men were convinced that the larger of the fork, the left fork, was not the one that they wanted. They wanted to follow the smaller, muddier one. So there's sort of confusion prevailing at this point in the Lewis and Clark expedition. And the expedition had maps with them. And in this case, the maps that they had with them weren't really helpful. In fact, they were confusing things even further. Because one of the maps that they had was this map that was provided for them by a man named Nicholas King. Nicholas King was commissioned by Albert Gallatin, who was Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury, to make a map for the expedition that had all of the sort of relevant information that they might need in order to find their way across the continent. But when they arrive at the confluence of the Marias and the Missouri, they're confronted with a map that looks like this. And if you're at all familiar with the Missouri watershed, it looks absolutely nothing like this. So if we look on our right side, we see it says Snake Nation, and we have the sort of the Great Bend of the Missouri, basically where Bismarck, North Dakota is today. And then this tremendous fork where the upper branch says Missouri and the lower branch says Lesser Missouri, which is not accurate. And so the expedition would have been following that Lesser Missouri route, the lower of those two lines, and then where they're confronted with yet another fork, this time unlabeled. On the left side of the screen where that fork leads, there's a little nubbin, and it's labeled Bear's Tooth. That's kind of an important detail, and I'll get back to that later. And so everything below this has been left blank, and we have this really helpful, most helpful note in the history of cartography, conjectural, written right there. So this map was actually not very original. It was sort of a cheap and hackneyed copy of a much bigger map made by a map maker in London named Aaron Arrowsmith. So he had started drawing out this map based on whatever data he could get from Spanish, English, French sources, trying to get an idea of what the interior of the continent of North America looked like. And 1793 is an important date because that's when Alexander Mackenzie's journals were published. And so he is including information from Mackenzie's two expeditions across Canada, one west and then north to the Arctic, and the other straight west to the sort of Fraser River Valley. And so there's an interesting note in this cartouche because it says that these are there are additions to 1802 in this map. And so if we sort of look at this map and look at these additions in 1802, In 1802, there was something sort of important happening, or rather in 1800, which was the Hudson's Bay Company was sort of pushing westward. So in addition to Alexander Mackenzie's addition to these maps, we have additions that are brought by people like Samuel Hearne and people like David Thompson and people like Peter Fiddler. So Peter Fiddler was at a place called Cumberland House, or rather Chesterfield House on the South Saskatchewan River, where it has a confluence with the Red Deer River. And this is in modern day Alberta. So Peter Fiddler had sent several maps to the Hudson's Bay Company, along with his sort of copious notes that he kept. He was a otherwise sort of obscure person who matters in Canadian history and the history of the West in general, largely because he was a very diligent note taker. And he kept some very careful journals, and he has very neat handwriting. And he established this place along with 18 other Hudson's Bay Company employees in 1800, this place called Chesterfield House. And the reason why he was allowed in there was because the local Blackfeet band, so at the time, the Blackfeet had formed into what's called the Niitsitapi, or the Blackfoot Confederacy. And it was composed of multiple bands of people, as we call them, the Blood, the Blackfeet, the Siksika, and the Gros Ventre. The Gros Ventre actually call themselves a Tsina name, which means white clay people. And so the Hudson's Bay Company had just established Chesterfield House amongst the Siksika people that lived at that confluence of the Saskatchewan and the Red Deer River. And they'd been invited into this place by a influential chief by the name of Akamoki, or Old Swan. And Old Swan was providing some intelligence as well as sort of protection to Peter Fiddler and the Hudson's Bay Company at this time. And he was wanting to know a lot more about the geography of this place that he was in. And his native informant was extremely helpful. The Hudson's Bay Company people called Akamoki Feathers for some reason, and I don't know why. And so Feathers drew this map in 1801, and then he drew this sort of revision of the map in February of 1802. And note our bear's tooth right up there at the top of your screen. And then a contemporary who was also a band member of the Siksika and a friend of Akamoki's named Kyokus, or Little Bear, drew this additional map. All three of these maps are in Peter Fiddler's journals, which are part of the Manitoba Provincial Archives, and they're available electronically. And so like every healthy adult male on pandemic, I've been going through old journals in archives and reading them. And so I was looking at these maps and how they sort of relate to both Aaron Arrowsmith and Nicholas King's maps, and how they may have sort of contributed to some of this confusion. So these additions to 1802 to Aaron Arrowsmith's map are these inclusions that were sent by Peter Fiddler of these two maps drawn by Akamoki. It could definitely be this particular map drawn in 1801, or it might be leaning on this map made in February of 1802. Conceivably, this map could have been drawn and sent to London and include an Arrowsmith's map by the end of that year. So if we look at these maps that look, absolutely nothing like the hydrology of the Upper Missouri as we know it, we see this sort of profusion of circles and symbols, and it's all been helpfully annotated and numbered by Peter Fiddler in his journal. And he has this sort of pair of parallel lines running along the top of the map. And then this, and we can presume that this might be the Rocky Mountains or the eastern front of the Rocky Mountains. And along that line are a series of letters. And these letters are essentially sort of culturally important places to the Blackfeet that have been listed by Fiddler in the lower right hand of the document. And then we have this sort of straight line of the Missouri River flowing into it. And so that like is sort of our starting point for understanding this map. And before we see it as something that's oversimplified or lacking in cultural information, or worse yet, conjectural, we need to first understand how to read maps like this, because this is a distinct indigenous cartographic style using a set of symbols that aren't so different from the ones we're used to. But the scale and style of map is very different from what we're used to. So to sort of get an idea of how to begin reading something like this, we need to think about subway maps. So this is two maps of the Mexico City subway system. On the left, we have the map that's given out by the City Tourism Bureau. And so if you're a tourist in Mexico City, you're usually wanting to see sites that are on the surface level. And so they've helpfully sort of superimposed the subway system onto the street map, so you know exactly where your subway stop is. On the right, we have the map that is put out by the Mexico City subway people. And when you're underground on the subway, it doesn't really matter, if each station stop is actually equidistant from the other. And it doesn't really matter if the subway line is curvilinear or straight. What matters to you is how many stops is it to where I need to change trains, or how many stops is it until I need to get off the train. So in that sense, Akamoki's map is a lot like this subway map. And so it's schematic and simplified, and it shows us pathways from one place to another, rather than trying to sort of accurately give you this sort of flying overhead view that we're used to seeing in maps that we see today. So the question is, like on the left here, I have a sort of basic map of Montana and its river system. So we have this sort of hydrologic map of Montana as we conceive of it in our culture today. And on the right, I have Akamoki's map from February of 1802. So how do we go from a map that looks like the one on the left to the one on the right? We start with things that we already know, or things that we know. We know that Peter Fiddler and Akamoki were at Chesterfield House. Chesterfield House was on the confluence of the Red Deer River and the Saskatchewan River. And we have the Saskatchewan labeled number 10 by Peter Fiddler, and the Red Deer River labeled number 9. So we know we're looking at two different drainage systems, the Saskatchewan on the right and the Missouri on the left. Next, we take things that are sort of geographically obvious. On all three maps in Fiddler's journals, we have these three sort of circular objects that have been labeled 3 paps or 3 nipples. And it's like, why is this keep showing up everywhere? And here we actually have a pathway going between those 3 paps and what appears to be the Rocky Mountain front that's labeled 5 Nights. And so this is an important place that people might want to go to and from. Where is this place? Well, if we think about what's out on the prairie landscape, we have the Sweetgrass Hills. They're composed of 3 different buttes that we call West Butte, Gold Butte, and East Butte today. So if we want to sort of include those things, well, here I've traced out the hydrology of the upper Missouri. So I've drawn a thick line showing the main sort of route of the Missouri River. And then I've sort of arbitrarily chosen rivers that have names that fit on this map, right? So we're not going to put a name on it unless it's sort of big enough. And in Montana, that usually means big enough to get a drift boat through, which is a different criterion than people would have been using in 1801 or 1802. But it sort of gives us an idea of which are the big rivers. So I've traced out the Milk River and the Musselshell, the Judith, the Smith, the Sun, the Teton, the Marias, and its 3 main branches. And then I've drawn in those 3 paps, or the Sweetgrass Hills, because those sort of stick out on this map, as well as sort of 3 little nubbins that I can draw some circles around. Next, I want to add that Rocky Mountain front. So in the map that Akamoki has drawn, we have this sort of straight double line barrier, and we have this straight Missouri River reaching into it. And that double line barrier is a sort of conceptual idea. It doesn't just mean the Continental Divide or the Rocky Mountain Front as we might imagine. The line is actually describing something that the Blackfeet call the Mistaka's. And this is a word that means backbone. It's sort of like the backbone of a bison. It's the backbone of the landscape. And it isn't limited to just the Rocky Mountain Front. If we go to Kaiokas's map, this is Little Bear, who was a member of Akamoki's band, the Siksika. He's drawn a slightly more helpful map that sort of meets our current cartographic expectations a little bit. He's drawn the Missouri and the Saskatchewan, and he's drawn the Mistakas as this sort of arcing barrier that wraps its way to the southeast, south of the Missouri River. So that kind of gives us a little bit of insight as to what the Mistakas was. If you're standing in the middle of the prairie in central Montana, you're effectively surrounded by mountains. And so the Mistakas included not just the Continental Divide or the eastern front of the Rockies, but it also included the Crazies and the mountains to the south that the Yellowstone flows from. So this is sort of a boundary. The bounded prairie world of the Blackfeet was this mountain range. And so in that sense, the Mistakas and the Missouri River sort of form these sort of axis mundi. As they intersect one another, you have the river meeting the mountains. So now we're sort of getting closer to the kind of map or seeing this the way that Akamoki would have seen it. Now we have to rotate the map. So if the Mistakas is an axis mundi and it sits at the top of the map, we've moved it to the top, and now we have our Missouri flowing perpendicularly into that mountain barrier. Now we got to get rid of the other map so it looks like what we want, add some labels, and now we have something more like what Peter Fiddler's working with. So we can take that map of the Missouri drainage, this sort of simplified subway map, and use it to sort of help us draw out the meaning of the map that it was drawn by Akamoki. We can start labeling things. And fortunately, all of these labels that he's added are names of places that mean the same thing in multiple languages. So sort of an interesting thing happened in 1779, well, a terrible thing really. There was a smallpox epidemic that broke out in Mexico City. And it worked its way north through the plains and eventually reached the northern plains and wiped out the Shoshone, or at least decimated their population to a great deal. And so prior to this point, the Shoshone had been sort of earlier than the Blackfeet to acquiring things like guns and horses, and they'd started encroaching on Blackfoot territory around the Missouri River. This arrival of smallpox weakened the Shoshone and sort of allowed the Blackfeet to sort of move back into what had been their traditional territory, where they'd been sort of forced up against the Saskatchewan River for a while. They were able to sort of move back out into the Missouri drainage. And all these place names on the Missouri drainage, because they had been inhabited by different groups of people at different times, have actually the same name in multiple languages. And sometimes these things, are easy to tease out because they have images of them. Like, for example, we have the bear's tooth up at the top left where I've labeled Gates of the Mountains. That shows up on our map from Nicholas King. And the word bear's tooth is basically the same name for in Blackfeet as it is in Atsina, as it is in Crow. So everyone's calling this thing the same thing. So we can say, all right, that represents the Gates of the Mountains. And there are other things on here as well that have like sort of very clear names that I don't actually have to spell out for you. Like if we look at number 21, we can see that that looks like a bear's paw. And we can probably guess what it represents, which is the Bear's Paw Mountains. So by taking these maps and sort of combining them and reading them together, we can start teasing out all the different things that are being displayed on here and align them with the geography that we know. But the question is, why the Sweetgrass Hills? And that why speaks to something cultural. So in this map, I've highlighted in yellow, this is the 1801 map that was drawn by Akamoki. we see this pathway that runs from the right-hand side of the map around past the Sweetgrass Hills and around the Smith River, through the gates of the mountains, and then back up to Chesterfield House. So this was a warpath that people had gone on shortly around the time when Akamoki drew this map. And the reason why they stopped at the Sweetgrass Hills is because out in the prairie, there aren't very many trees. And the Sweetgrass Hills is actually a place where you can find subalpine fir. And subalpine fir is a very hard tree to find. It's usually associated with the Rocky Mountain front. And the needles of the subalpine fir are a necessary component of the Blackfoot Thunderpipe ritual. You have to burn these leaves as incense in order to conduct that ritually correctly. So if you want to have that ritual and you're out traveling on the plains, you have to stop at Sweetgrass Hills and you have to get some subalpine fir so you can have your rituals. So this is a place of extreme cultural importance. It doesn't just stick out on this map and figure on all of these maps because it's something that sticks out on the plains. We know that the Bears Paw Mountains stick out on the plains, but they're not drawn on this map because they don't have cultural importance. So when we look at our map from 1802, we can see that Fiddler has labeled these rivers, right? So we have our three paps to orient us, and we know that the Milk River flows to the north of the Sweetgrass Hills, and we know that the Marias flows to the south of the Sweetgrass Hills, and it's effectively sort of sandwiched in between these two rivers. And he's helpfully named both of these rivers for us. He's labeled the Milk River Kinaxisata, and that name means Little River in Blackfeet. And he's labeled the Marias Kayosisata, and that means Bears River, which is the Blackfoot name for the Marias. But if we look at his 1801 river, we can once again locate our Sweetgrass Hills, and we see the Omakati, the big river, the Missouri, forming this sort of axis mundi with the Mistakas. And flowing from that, we have the Milk River, the Kinaxisata, the Little River. And then we see where we should be seeing the Marias River, a different name, a different river. And instead of saying Kayosisata, Bears River, it's labeled Natutukase, which means the Two Medicine River. So since not everybody who's on this call actually is deeply familiar with the hydrology of the northern plains of Montana, the Two Medicine River is actually just a minor tributary, one of the three that form the Marias on the Blackfoot Reservation. There's sort of three major creeks that come together to form the Marias. On the south branch, there's the Birch Creek. On the north, there's Cutbank Creek. And in the middle is the Two Medicine River. And this map is a Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks map that shows the Marias drainage. And so we can see in orange down in the lower right corner, I've labeled the Missouri. And in the middle is the red part. That's the Marias River proper, the sort of main channel, Kayosisata Bears River. And then the purple is that tributary creek, the Two Medicine River, Natutukase. And that name, Two Medicine, comes from the Blackfoot word. The Natu portion is a particle that indicates the number two. And then the Oka is a reference to the Okan ceremony, the Sundance ceremony. And the Ase portion is the river bit, right? So it's the Two Sundance Lodge River that we call the Two Medicine River. And it's called that because there is a place along this river where there used to be two Sundance lodges. So it's a place of cultural importance. And that cultural importance sort of gets me back to why it was that I showed you this image of a Blackfoot woman working a switchboard at the beginning of this talk. So what I want to talk about now is sort of Blackfoot information systems. In this book, this picture is of a woman named Helen. This is 1933. She was the switchboard operator at the the Mini Glacier Hotel, and she is a Blackfoot woman. And in 1933, working a telephone switchboard was a high-tech gig. And so that's why I chose that image, because what we're going to talk about now is high tech for the Blackfeet in 1800. And as I mentioned, when people were traveling across the plains, they would stop at places like the Sweetgrass Hills in order to get incense for their thunderpipe. And the thunderpipe bundle and bundles in general are these complex objects, these sort of high-tech information systems for the Blackfeet that allowed them to do multiple things. First off, remember stuff. These were sort of like portable libraries, and they were filled with multiple objects. So a thunderpipe was acquired by the American Museum of Natural History in 1912, and they sort of like went through and bloodlessly cataloged every little object in it. And there's just an insane number of things in this relatively small pipe bundle compared to some of the larger bundles that the Blackfeet had, such as the beaver bundle. And there's all kinds of odd bits in here: skin of a prairie dog, skin of a squirrel, skin of a muskrat, skin of a mink, an owl skin. Each one of these objects sort of represents a story or a ritual, as well as a relationship between the Blackfeet and their ecology, or possibly even a historical occurrence. So when one opens up a bundle like this, you're compelled to conduct certain rituals and sing certain songs, tell certain stories, and remember certain things. And some of those things that people remembered because of these bundles included knowing when, where, and how to harvest bison. So having a bundle essentially made you a sort of scholar in your community, a scientist, a historian, a priest, all rolled into one. And the place where people understood how to read and speak these kinds of bundles would have been a very important place in 1800. And the middle of the Two Medicine River, the valley that it flows through, in Blackfeet is a place called Mota'atusi, the place where the bundle owners live. And archaeologically, that place is insane. Like there are just scads of bison drive lines. And what bison drive lines are these sort of stacks of stones that people have piled up in these straight lines that go sometimes for miles in order to trick wild bison into sort of meandering into them. And then they sort of lead a few in, and then they follow each other off a cliff where they're either killed or butchered. And there are lots of these in this area. And archaeologists call the particular area on the right what's the Katoyis complex. So this is a larger view of Mota'atusi, where there are multiple sort of settlements and bison harvesting facilities. So we're going to focus on one of those, the Katoyis complex. And so just to give you an idea of what a bison driveline actually looks like, here's a sort of simple one. As you can imagine, you just have people standing on either side of those two lines in that funnel, and then you've got people waiting at the other side of the blind to kill the animals as they go through. Or better yet, if you've got a really big cliff, you can just have them run right off the cliff. And these drive lines get adjusted over time so that the bison can't see exactly where they're going to fall off, and they get perfected bit by bit. So these like drive lines can shift on the landscape, which is why we see so many piles of rocks out there in the northern plains. And the number of animals that could be killed at one go was very large. So you needed a very large area to just process all of that meat, fat, and bone. And all of that meat was able to support a very large population of people. So if we look at this map, and this is work done by an archaeologist at the University of Arizona named Maria Nieves Cedeno, along with the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Blackfeet, a man named John Murray. And when they went out to catalog these things, John Murray was just astonished at how much is out there. He called it a location of monumental stone surface architecture. So we have these sort of drive lines leading into this Katoyis complex. And we can see how there's some faded lines here. And those are our black lines. So people were sort of moving and adjusting these drive lines over time, trying to get them better and better and better at making the bison effectively come to their processing facility. If we look at the gray dots on this map, each one of those gray dots represents essentially a teepee ring or a household. So what a teepee ring is nothing more than a circle of rocks that's lying out on the plains. And there are literally hundreds of thousands of these things. Archaeologists in Alberta attempted to inventory all the teepee rings in just the Blackfeet section of Alberta in the 1970s, and they sort of gave up around 600,000. So there's a lot of these things out there, and there's an awful lot of them at the Cotillas complex. And what these represent are just the stones that were used to weigh down the perimeter of a tent. And these are fairly large tents, so each circle represents a household, and a household can be anywhere from 2 to 8 or more people living in each one of these things. So at this Cotillas complex, and mind you, the Cotillas complex is sort of one of 3 such sites in that sort of greater Mota-Atusi area. There were over 3,000 stone surface features inventoried, 11 driveline systems for bison harvesting, some of them extending for 2.5 miles, and there were 899 teepee rings. So if we imagine we can imagine a population of possibly 4,000 or more people at each one of these sites. And the other interesting bit is that the radiocarbon dates from these sites indicate that this place was seasonally inhabited year after year. It was sort of like a town that people would show up to and then abandon for 700 years. And every year it got a little bigger because they got better and better at convincing bison to show up to them. And they were able to do this because of complex technologies like bundles and their keepers who helped them keep track of these things. What's interesting about Mota-Atusi is that Meriwether Lewis passed right through it. So on July 25th of 1806, Lewis has broken off from the larger body of people and is trying to make contact, presumably, with the Blackfeet and see if the Marias River cuts a little bit into British territory so it can cadge a little land from the English. And he notes that Drury Fields informed him that it was about 10 miles to the Missouri. And oops, I didn't mean to jump ahead there. And they noticed this huge area of teepee rings. And he considered himself extremely fortunate not having met with these people. So if he'd been there 6 weeks earlier, he would have run into Mota-Atusi when it was a fully populated Blackfoot town. So what all this does is sort of makes this map start to make more sense. So unlike our sort of hydrologic map of Montana, where we put names on rivers that are sort of big enough to float a boat down, the Blackfeet weren't sort of thinking about this in the same way. Each tributary represents a path, and not just a path, but a path to someplace important. In the wintertime, most of the Blackfoot population would have been living in the various valleys, basically hunkered up against the shelter of the Eastern Front. And so when we look at the 2 maps made by Akamoki, where he's labeled the Marias, the Bears River in one, which is the proper Blackfoot name, and then labeled the Marias, the Two Medicine in the other, which is the name of a minor tributary of the Marias that does not flow directly into the Missouri, it does not mean that Akamoki didn't understand the geography of his own country. Rather, it speaks to the cultural values that this map conveys. That river is labeled the Two Medicine because it leads to the place where the bundle owners live. It leads to a place of importance. And by that token, each one of these straight lines represents not necessarily a major river, but a line or a route to a major place in the Blackfoot world in 1801 or 1802. So what was important to Lewis and Clark and Akamoki were 2 very different things. So now I want to sort of shift gears and tell a different story. And this one is sort of about place names and what we can do with place names. So I'm an archaeologist, and I'm supposed to be talking about things like rocks, and people are probably expecting me to talk about Tune's map, which is part of that traveling exhibit at Travelers Rest right now. But I didn't want to. So So here we are. So what I want to talk about now is how we can use sort of unusual artifacts. I mean, we already talked about these old documents, these maps, and thunder pipe bundles. You know, these are sort of material culture items that convey information. And it's not just maps and objects that can store information, but the names of places can store information as well. And sometimes that information can be correct. Sometimes it can be incorrect, but it's usually very illuminating. So what I want to talk about is the Lolo Trail. And the Lolo Trail is a place that was sort of made famous by the Lewis and Clark expedition because every time they went up on it, they sort of had a rough time. And, you know, this is what happens when you're at high altitude in September. It might snow on you, it might rain. But the trail that they were following, this Lolo Trail, is part of a much longer route, and a very old one at that. So the Lolo Trail portion is just sort of this unusual high altitude segment of this road called the Kakaliskit. Now that's a word in the Nez Perce language, which is hard enough to pronounce that I can't even say the name of the language. But the Lolo Trail is just this high altitude portion that follows a ridge line. Right now, it runs parallel to Highway 12, and the Lolo Trail is also what's known in the Forest Service calls it the 500 road. And if you've ever driven up there, it's a sort of axle bending, tire popping mess, and you don't want to do it in a Prius. But the route itself was sort of improved in 1933 by the CCC, so that's why we have this dirt road up there today. And then in 1964, Highway 12 was built. And that route that Highway 12 follows simply wasn't possible in the past because the Loxa Canyon is so narrow and that road is basically built on fill. So people had to take this ridgeline route in the past. And people have been taking that route for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Some of the work, there was an inventory done by the archaeologist Sarah Scott, whose former office, I'm told, is now occupied by Molly, who's hosting this. And her dissertation research, she published as an article about the Kakaliskit, and she made this map that shows this sort of the wider, the greater Lolo Trail, if you will, and how it extends out into the places that we just discussed. But the Lolo Trail itself, the high altitude portion, when you're not on the 500 road, you can actually get out and follow the ancient road itself. In some places, it's easy enough to follow and it doesn't require any markings, especially on sort of exposed ridge lines where there aren't many trees. And you can imagine if you're trying to travel through here on horses, these are the kinds of areas where you'd want to go through so that there is at least sort of minimal fodder for those animals. In other places where the route is more ambiguous, there are stone cairns to sort of guide your way from one place to the next. In others, there are still these sort of like depressed trackways where people traveling over the route over and over again for thousands of years has literally like sort of left a depression up on the ridge line that you can still pick up in a few places. So that's what that image is on the right. And you can see how sort of trees have grown into the middle of that trackway. So the antiquity of this trail is attested to, once again, by archaeological research. We have a place called the Kelly Fork site. So this red dashed line is sort of the Lolo Trail, the ancient route, as it's been inventoried by archaeologists. And then we have Kelly Creek is a campground on the Clearwater River, or as it was called in the Lewis and Clark journals, the Chapunish, that has a very old radiocarbon date associated with it. There's a campsite, campfire that had a date from 13,500 years ago. And what's interesting is that sort of artifact assemblage from this place. You have stone tools with sort of that represent two different artifact traditions. One is called the Western Stem tradition, which is something that you see in the Columbia Plateau. And the other is what's called the Goshen tradition, which is a sort of style of stone tool that you see in the Northern Plains. And in this place, you see both. Additionally, obsidian tools, and obsidian is sort of volcanic glass that makes extremely sharp implements, obsidian implements can be traced to their source using X-ray fluorescence. And so if the raw material for the obsidian knife comes from Yellowstone, you can trace it back to Yellowstone. And the obsidian tools found at this site can be traced to sites in Oregon, Idaho, and northeastern Montana. So we have these sort of like disparate places that people are pulling tools from. So people are passing through these mountains on the only known route through them over and over again for at least 13,000 years. So this begs the question, why do we call it the Lolo Trail? What does this name mean? If you go and delve into the historical record, you find some rather thin gruel. The most recent reference to it was Bud Moore's book, The Locksaw Story. He was a Forest Service guy who wrote a history of this region where the Lolo Trail is. And he talks about how the Lolo Trail was named after a trapper named Lawrence, who had a trap line in that area. And and that the native people in their languages, they didn't have R's, so they couldn't say Lawrence, and they called the guy Lulu. He has a footnote in this book, and he cites L.V. McWhorter. And L.V. McWhorter was a very meticulous historian. His work on the history of the Yakima actually helped them reclaim tribal land in court. And so he set to work helping the Nez Perce in a similar way by writing a history of the 1877 Nez Perce War, where he interviewed people who were there. But before he finished the book, he died. And posthumously, his children pulled his notes together, published his book. And if you look at the footnote where he talks about the origins of the Lolo Trail story, you find out that it isn't a very good source for a historian like McWhorter. He was relying on essentially a story that he heard at a hot spring. And I don't know about the rest of you, if you've ever hung out at a hot spring, you hear lots of stories, and not all of them are necessarily the most credible. I can think of being at Jerry Johnson Hot Springs one time where I met a naked guy from Alaska, and he told me about how one time there was a bear rooting around in the garbage in front of his house, and in order to get rid of it, it was first thing in the morning, and he just had a coffee and a cigarette, and he hadn't brushed his teeth, so he leaned out the front door and went and just sort of breathed on the bear with his cigarette, coffee, morning breath, and the bear ran away. So those are the kinds of stories you hear at hot springs. And, you know, like not all of them are necessarily credible. So what I want to offer you is a somewhat more believable story about how the Lolo Trail came to be. And there's lots of reasons why we shouldn't necessarily believe this story about a trapper named Lawrence. And the first reason is the Sahaptin languages that the Nez Perce language is part of. So Sahaptin languages have two branches. There's the Nez Perce language, and then there's Sahaptin proper. And they have sort of certain characteristics. It's an agglutinative language, which means that place names are extremely descriptive, and they're never of people. So for instance, on the Yakima Reservation, there is a place called Tepenish. And the word Tepenish in Sahaptin means that which suddenly goes forth. And what it's describing is this landform on the lower right of this slide, this big landslide. So the word actually sort of contains a sort of geologic description of how that place came to be, as well as making it an easy thing to identify if you happen to be walking through this landscape. Additionally, like there is a trail that runs from the Columbia drainage into the uplands. And when you come up into the uplands, you reach a place called Wapanidya, Oregon. And this is a word that means comes out into the open. So in this sense, this word sort of gives you directions. It lets you know when you get to this place that you are in the right place. It's as though it's evocative of the place that it's describing. And so like when it comes to like sort of larger objects, things like mountains and rivers, those weren't usually given names at all amongst Sahaptin speaking people. Usually it was more specific things like a particular fishing site on a river or a particular village on a river. And a lot of names for tribes today actually come from these sort of particular places along these rivers. So for example, the fishing area in the modern day Dalles, Oregon, this has been, is basically underwater because the Dalles Dam, but it was called Inn. And the reason why it was called that was because of a story, a coyote story about a cradle board. And so the name was supposed to evoke the memory of this story, which sort of told you how this place came to be. And so the important thing here to remember is that, like, as Sahaptin speaking people like the Nez Perce are not going to name a place after a person like Lawrence, because that's not their job. Plateau Indians didn't name places for people for one very good reason. People do not name places, period. That's Coyote's job. And we have to remember, of course, that Coyote was a trickster. So, he's got all kinds of names for things, but they're just never going to be of people in particular. So that sort of leaves us with, what is true about the name of the Lolo Trail and the story that we've been given. And so far, that is, there aren't any R's in their language. So they wouldn't have been able to pronounce Lawrence. So that part's true. But we'll get at what does the name mean, right? So this takes us to the Oregon coast of all places. And the reason why I showed you a picture of the native family in that old car at the beginning of this slideshow, that's a Coeur d'Alene man named Philip Wildshoe. And that picture was taken in 1916, and he was very proud of his automobile. And so this is a story, the story of the Lolo Trail is the story of the wider Northwest and the language that connected it in the 19th century. And the reason why there needed to be a common language in the Northwest in the 19th century was because it was one of the most linguistically diverse places in the Americas. The Willamette Valley has so many different languages that it was necessary for there to be a sort of trade language in common for people to actually communicate and get along with one another. And that trade language in the 19th century became a thing that's called Chinook jargon. And it has a rather unusual story that begins with Captain James Cook visiting Vancouver Island in 1778. He runs into the native people there who are called the Nootka. And while he's there, the Nootka sort of pick up this idea that people who look like James Cook speak English. Meanwhile, Mexico is kicking up trade with the Philippines. So this is what's called the Manila Galleon trade. The Spanish were basically taking goods from their colonies in the Philippines and carrying them across the sort of narrow landmass of Mexico and then shipping them off to Europe. And in order to move things between the Philippines and the Mexican coast, they relied on trade winds. And it was easy enough to follow the trade winds to the west to get to Manila. But when they followed the trade winds to the North Pacific to return, they would often land somewhere on the west coast of North America and not know exactly where they were. So they needed to sort of mapping the west coast so they knew where safe harbors were, sources of water, potential allies, potential enemies, etc. So the Spanish crown sends this guy, Dionisio Alcala Galiano, to go map the west coast of North America. And so he goes and sails north and works his way south and maps along the way. When he gets up to Vancouver Island, he runs into the Nootka. And the Nootka speak to him in Nootka in English. Why? Because he looks like James Cook. And when he travels down to the mouth of the Columbia River, he encounters the Chinook people, who were the traders who sort of controlled most of the trade on the Columbia River. And the Chinook had two languages. They were a slave society, and the upper class people flattened their heads and spoke a very complicated language that is dead now. And they also had a simplified language for the slaves. And the slaves didn't have flattened heads. So there was two ways to identify what your social class was. One, you had a weird shaped head and you spoke a very complicated language. The other, you spoke a simple language and you looked normal. So that simplified Chinook became the sort of basis of Chinook jargon. And the sort of, it took shape when Galiano shows up and he sees these people and he tries to speak with them. And he thinks they speak Nootka. And so he's got a little Nootka peppered with English and Spanish, and he's trying to speak to the Chinook. Now the Chinook, when George Vancouver shows up on the scene, see a guy who looks kind of like Galiano. And so they speak to him in this combination of Chinook, Nootka, Spanish, and English. And eventually, things like the Hudson's Bay Company established Astoria, Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River, and they brought with them Métis and Iroquois workers who spoke things like Cree, Iroquois, and French. And so all of these languages get combined on this sort of basic Chinookan grammar and form this trade language called Chinook jargon, which eventually spreads throughout the Northwest and becomes the lingua franca up until as late as the 1940s in some places. In Chinook jargon, the word lolo means to carry. In this sense, it's closer to the Yiddish term schlep. If you've ever heard, something is a schlep, or you had to schlep this thing from point A to point B, lolo is kind of used in the same way. So we have our Lolo Trail by Missoula and our Lolo Pass, which is a place where you're definitely doing some schlepping. And likewise, along the Columbia River on the shoulder of Mount Hood, there's another Lolo Pass. So the Columbia has a lot of waterfalls in this place. And if you were moving things downriver, this would be a place where you had to get out in portage and start schlepping gear over land. So my argument here is that the word Lolo is a Chinook jargon word. And the reason being is that missionaries had come to the Nez Perce and they had translated the Bible into Chinook jargon so they could missionary to lots of folks who spoke lots of different languages, but all of whom spoke this language in common. And the Nez Perce carried this new sort of missionary language across the Bitterroots and into places like Lolo. And we see sort of traces of this language all over the landscape in the Northwest. If you see a word like Skookumchuck, there's one in Idaho near Riggins. There's a Skookumchuck River near Olympia, Washington. And stuck is a Salish root word that basically means water. And so Skookum means monster. And you put them together, you've got whitewater. There's words like Oolali that show up all over the place. And this is sort of a resource word. It's a place name telling you where you can find food. If you're looking for huckleberries, look for a place with a name like Oolali. If you're looking for metal, it's just west of Lolo is a place called the Chickaman Mine, and there's a Chickaman Road. And the word Chickaman means metal in Chinook jargon. And so all these places named Chickaman are places where precious metals were found and miners were in operation. So when in 1877, during the Nez Perce War, when the Nez Perce were being chased by Howard across the Bitterroot Mountains, and they get to Fort Fizzle, everyone decides to not fight, and the Nez Perce moves slowly through the Bitterroot Valley. Chief Joseph actually chose to speak to the people who were living in the Bitterroot Valley, even though he spoke English perfectly well, in Chinook jargon rather than English. And the reason for that was on some level political. He was trying to say, I speak the Nez Perce language, you speak English, but all of us speak Chinook jargon. This is something that belongs to all of us. And so it was sort of a message of unity by choosing that language to speak in. There are other things, other resources. Mowich means deer. So if you want to go hunting, look for a place called Mowich. If you're looking for some place that's especially beautiful, Tokati means beautiful. And Flushman means woman. So if you're looking for women, this could help, although they might have left by now. If you're looking for things like camas bulbs, words like clackamas in Portland. The word clackamas, tla, is just a sort of a particle like V. So it means the camas. And then there's all sorts of other resources that we can find looking at place names in the Chinook jargon language. And sometimes these things like the Wapato, there's lots of places named Wapato, this is making it archaeological, is actually a cultigen. And people in the Northwest have been taking things like camas and Wapato and transplanting them in places that are beyond their natural range. So we see a place with a name like Wapato or camas, and it's outside the natural range of that place. That's an indication that this is a place where people were essentially engaged in farming. And we've seen this in the Vancouver area. this aquaculture site was found where people were deliberately planting wapato, and they even left behind some of their gardening tools. In the East, we can sort of see a similar phenomenon at work. If we look at just the way place names sort of lie in the landscape, they show us history in a way that that other artifacts sort of can't. So the Lenape or the Delaware people were sort of forced eastward and eastward and eastward over time, from basically North New Jersey into Indiana and then to places like Oklahoma. And the people from northern New Jersey, they lived in a rocky place, and their word in Lenape for that rocky place was Minisink. And that eventually got corrupted into names like Muncie. So if you sort of trace places with names like Muncie, you can sort of follow the Delaware as they were pushed westward. So in that sense, like these sort of words like Lolo show us the sort of eastern extent of languages like Chinook jargon, in the same way that words like Muncie show us the western extent of the Delaware forced migration. So that said, I want to sort of like open this up to questions, and like we can ride in our minds across these sorts of landscapes right now, but this summer, if you've stuck with me for this long and you'd like 3 days of this mess, I'm going to be doing a trip on the Upper Missouri Breaks, where I'm going to be talking about archaeology and landscape and all the things we talked about today. August 14th through 16th, go to trailadventures.com. If you want to hike the Lolo Trail with me, we're going August 18th through 20th. If you want to do both, you can like sign up for both, and we can talk about this for days. So that said, let's look and see if we have questions.
Wow. Thanks, Kevin. That's just so much information. I hope everybody's brain has expanded the way that mine has. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I think I'm going to start with one of my own, which is, we get the question here at Travelers Rest all the time about the origin of the word Lolo. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to start with a question just about, can you give me a resource to learn a little bit more about Chinook jargon? Where can I?
There's a book out there. It's called Making Wawa.
Okay.
And Wawa is how you say speak in Chinook jargon. And I'm blanking on the author's name right now. I'm sorry.
Okay.
He's Elizabeth from Portland State. And he sort of wrote the history of Chinook jargon, and has been sort of a person who's been part of revitalizing the language. The Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde still speak the language and encourage people to learn it. And then the native people in Kamloops, British Columbia, still speak the language.
Right.
And the Grand Ronde are like, they have a published dictionary. And so all that, I learned the language from them. They used to have a language roundtable where you could sit and just speak in the language and
wow. Wow. And it seems to me, it's sort of, again, as we read the journals, we hear a lot about the sign language, the common sign language that's used for translation across the continent. And I'm assuming it's sort of the same thing, that it was just a way of communicating that evolved over time as more and more people came into contact with one another.
Right. I mean, you see similar things happen in, the Louisiana area. You have, there was a language there called Mobilian jargon, and it was a mishmash of French and Muskogean and various other languages. And you sort of see there's remnants of it in that old Mardi Gras song, Giacomo, Aiko, and Giacomo. Like, what does that mean? Well, it's in Mobilian jargon and no one speaks it. So, that's, so Chinook jargon was spoken, like in the Northwest, it was really useful because of the fact that you had immigrants coming in from all over the world. And I've heard that, like, in the early 40s, when they sort of ramped up production for World War II in Seattle, you had Chinese workers, native workers, all kinds of people working together who didn't speak English, and Chinook jargon was how they got by.
Wow.
So it sort of served a purpose up until a point where everyone started learning English, and then it sort of fell out of favor, except for, you know, the places where people think of it as a sort of culturally valuable language to maintain.
Right.
And the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde is basically made up of a bunch of groups who speak completely unrelated languages. So it's sort of a language of unity for them.
Right. Very cool. All right, I have a question here. Oh, actually, a little bit more on this topic a bit. Have you reviewed Joe Musselman's research on the name Lolo? And I guess on the lewis-clark.org website, there are lots of different possibilities of how the name Lolo comes up. Yeah, okay. And we do use that site a lot. And I guess the question was, you know, when you were talking or researching and came up with the Chinook jargon thought process for Lolo, did you sort of end up going down all kinds of different passages too, looking at where the name Lolo came?
Well, I mean, for me, it was just like I immediately knew what the word meant, because I Niga Kumdux Wawa Chinook Wawa. And so I was like, oh, that means schlep, you know, well, it sure is. And like, you know, so like it just, and then I saw, you know, all these sort of context clues like chickaman and you know, things that are around it that make it make sense, you know. And it's just sort of, it's just, this is, you know, Missoula is the far eastern edge of the Pacific Northwest, so that language sort of came and went relatively quickly. And you know, whereas it's sort of heartland is further west from
right. That's cool. I love the translation schlep. That's for a Pennsylvania girl. I know what that means. I get schlep. I don't see any other big questions in the chat. Is there anybody that wanted to ask something directly? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Kevin. Bob and I thoroughly enjoyed it, as usual, and we highly recommend the Lewis and Clark Trail. We did it a couple of years ago with Kevin, and it was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Aunt Carol.
That's great. Oops, I have one new message down here. Let's see what I'm getting a lot of. Thanks. Can we have you back in the wintertime in person after COVID? This was great. So I have a feeling you're going to be hearing from us again for sure.
Well, thanks everyone for your attention. It was fun.
We really appreciate you. Everybody, our next session is going to be Saturday, May 1st. We are going to have the Salish poet Victor Charlot and his daughter Claire Charlot, who is an Indigenous rights activist. And we're going to hear a little bit about the things that they're reflecting on at this point in contemporary Salish life. So, and here was one more question that just popped up, which, yes, we did record this session. I will put the link on our website within the next couple of days. So again, thank you so much, Kevin. Thanks to everybody who came today, and we'll see you again in May.
Thanks, Molly.
Bye.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Kevin. Great to see you.
Good to see you too, Ralph.